Hello, and welcome to yet another one of the exciting videos in which I explain some stuff to you. This time we're going to be talking about primary source analyses, the first one of which you have due by midnight on Monday, February the 6th, which is obviously coming up in about a week. So, right here, you can see where we are. Primary source analysis due midnight, Monday, February the 6th. And that's what we're going to talk about, what this primary source analysis is and what it entails. So by this point in time, you should have looked at the actual rubric itself. Hang on a second, and I will get us to that. Here we go. Primary source analysis 1. It's pretty straightforward. It requires, though, that you have 3 primary sources. Now, I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to point out that there is an excellent video here that you should go watch if you're still having questions. But a primary source is a document written in the past by someone living at the time period, right? For each of your primary source analyses, you're going to need 3 of them. For this first analysis, to make life easier for you, I have picked a collection of 9 of them from which you will need to choose 3. And here they are. An Aztec account of the conquest of Mexico, a Mayan account of the Spanish conquest, some extracts from Christopher Columbus himself, an extract from the Council of Castile, discussing how Spanish conquerors should be treating the natives, letters from Michel de Cuneo, talking about what he saw while he was in the Caribbean, Bartolomé de las Casas, a very significant writer. Almost all of the textbooks talk about him because he was one of the first Spanish people going with the conquistadors to actually take the Spanish to task for their treatment of the native peoples. Pope Paul III himself, and then Queen Isabella of Spain. You may pick any combination of 3 of these. You're going to be using them to support your arguments, your answers to the actual question itself, which will be coming up in a moment. Now, before you actually start looking at them and thinking about them, here's some other videos you should watch so you have some idea of what we're talking about when we talk about what I refer to as perspective or bias of the people writing these documents, right? Because that's part of what critical thinking is. It's analyzing not only what is said, but why it is said, right? That's the critical thing. Looking past the words on the page and asking questions about why those words are actually there. All right, so historical thinking, bias in primary sources, how to identify it, how to analyze primary sources. That'll give you some ideas of things to look at. Again, all of these are really good demonstrations, examples, explanations of how historians read documents and the things that you, as an historian in this class, are going to need to be thinking about as well. Also, if you haven't watched it already, because I had it in week 1, The Rise of the West in Historical Methodology is an excellent video as well, basically talking again about this concept of how we tell the story of history and to a certain extent why we tell it, especially here in the United States, from the position of the West. So definitely check into that if you did not watch it in week 1. All right, so here's the actual question you're looking at. Using your textbook, the other required readings for the past 3 weeks, the videos, and 3 different primary sources discuss the history of what we refer to today as Columbus Day. Now, right here, straight up, notice how many sources you need. You need your textbook, whichever one of the textbooks you're using. The other required readings for the past 3 weeks, almost all of which I believe were Frankopan. So that's 3 different chapters from Frankopan. The videos, specifically the videos from week 1 that were required, and then the 3 different primary sources, whichever 3 you pick from the list that was right up there at the top. So you've already got 1, 4, 7, and then whichever of the videos you're using, up to 10 sources that you're going to be citing, as in using in the course of making your argument, right? So your works cited is going to have at least 7 to 10 in it. discuss this history. Why do we debate it today? Who were the Taino and why don't we celebrate them? How is the debate about Columbus Day a reflection of historiography? Aha, that big word, historiography, the history of how we write history, and the ways in which our interpretation of history changes. What did the people of the time period, as in the 1500s, think of the discovery of the New World, or the integration of the Western Hemisphere into the global trading network? And how is it related to how we view it today? And then here's the key part. This again, the critical thinking. What biases are present in the primary sources, the videos, your textbooks, and Frankopan, everything else that you're using? What is your bias and why? Why did you choose the three primary sources that you chose, and why didn't you choose the others? What did you leave out and why? So a lot of what you're going to be analyzing in this paper is how you think of history, what perspective you tell it from, and why you tell it from that perspective. So it's going to mean going past how you've thought about it in the past and what other courses you've had, and thinking about it in terms of how you see it today and what it means. All right, as with all of the things that we're doing, the discussions, all of the papers, you want to look at the grading rubric itself, which is included at the bottom of this. Citation is mandatory, as in no citation, your grade's going to be a 0. And this means internal citation, where you use your parentheses, put the author's name, the date. If it's from a source like Frankopan or your textbook, you also put the page number. I'm seeing a lot of people leaving the page numbers out on the discussions. That's going to bring your citation grade down. Citation is mandatory both internally and with your works cited page in APA. And again, a web link by itself is not a citation. That is only a location. A full citation is always author, title, date, location. Always author, title, date, location. I have linked some APA citation guides, what the works cited page is and how it should look. And if you're still having trouble with this concept of historiography, here are some really, really good videos on what historiography is and effectively how it changes the way we view history, right? All right, here also is the grading rubric for it. Again, your general knowledge, which is where you talk about the actual history. The critical thinking, which is where you talk about why things are the way they are, how we view these things. Then your primary sources. Now notice right here, a distinguished primary source analyzes the sources and the bias of the authors, taking into account time and situation, right? So you want to be looking and considering as you're reading them what the person who wrote it was arguing for, what their belief system was, how they viewed these things, what they thought and why they thought it, right? Citation and clarity, again, in many respects, this is more citation than clarity. Most of you know how to write a paper at this point. Your discussions all seem to be pretty on point. But citation, again, is required definitely in the three big things when you quote, as in you copy and paste something from an author directly as they wrote it, and it must be in quotation marks, and you will want to use quotes because that's how you demonstrate to me what the people at the time thought about this stuff, right? It's by taking actual direct quotes from them. You can also use that in your section, actually analyzing their motivations, their perspectives, their biases, right? The second time you must cite is when you paraphrase. If you're going to tell me a little bit about what was going on in the world in the 1500s when Columbus and the conquistadors were running around Central and South America, then you're going to need to put some of that with citation because a lot of it's stuff that you've gotten from the textbooks or from Frankopan, right? And the third time you must cite is when something isn't common knowledge. So almost always, if you're using a date, if you're using numbers of any kind, those almost always have to be cited because they're very few that most of us keep in our conscious, active, working minds. But also, if it is something, if you're talking about Columbus having slaves, making slaves of the Native Americans, well, that's not something most people think about these days because we don't get taught that in a lot of history classes. So that is not common knowledge and something that you would need to put that citation for, right? All right. So there's your rubric. Here's the question. Here are the sources you're going to be using. Now, for your benefit, I have a sample paper. It is a sample paper from my Civ 1 class, so it is not relevant to this course, which is why I'm using it. But I'm going to go through it pretty quickly, and I will send a copy of it to you as well, so you can actually see what I'm talking about, right? All right, so sample primary source paper. Now, for this particular course, here was the question. As with yours, it says using your textbooks, the other required readings for the past 3 weeks, and 3 different primary sources, which for this paper, this person had to find themselves. And in fact, for your primary source analyses 2, 3, and 4, you will be finding them. I will not be giving you choices like I did with this one. On this first one, this is basically just to help you figure out what a primary source is. For the next 3, you'll be doing the research to find those on your own. So, in this case, using these sources, the question is, discuss the evolution of transcendent religions and philosophies. How and why did they develop? How and why are they a product of the classical societies, which effectively are societies of Rome, the emerging Islamic empires, Persia, classical Mayan societies. These are things out of Civ 1, so I'm not going to go into big details about that, but this is a particular period of time, much like the period that we're discussing right now. It's what is referred to as the early modern period, right? All right, so how are they a product of these classical societies? What does their development say about the growing complexity of societies and people? How and why did they lead to the development of theocracies? How and why did they lead to schisms? And how did these schisms affect the growth and stability of empires? What is the relationship between transcendent religions and the politics of empires? And then, as with yours, what biases are present in the primary sources, your textbook, and the supplemental readings for the past 3 weeks? That part of the question, very much like what you've got in yours. All right, so what I've done with this sample paper is annotated it. Anytime you see these sections that are in all caps, that is where I have made a note, basically, in this case, outlining the paper itself. This first section, the author of this paper was attempting to answer the question from the historical perspective using a lot of history. Now, I'm going to point out to you, of course, the author uses Strayer and Nelson, which was the textbook. It is volume 1, whereas those of you who are using it for this course will be using volume 2. Frankopan was also one of the books from which there were chapters that were required. The author of this paper uses Frankopan in the course of responding to this, so that's 2 of the things that are necessary already. And then goes down here and, as you should, actually takes one of the primary sources that this author chose and quotes directly from it to support the idea put forth in this. In this case, provides an example of a political leader acknowledging a religion's power to aid his leadership and influence, which goes directly to that concept of creating a theocracy, right, which was part of that question. The next part is, as with all of yours, all of these questions that you're going to be dealing with are going to be on a global scale, not just focused on one section of the world or one particular political system or belief system or whatever. In this particular case, the author moves on to Han China, talking about Confucianism, right? And one of the sources that this person used was an image reflecting the exam-based Confucian system that was developed in China as part of its meritocracy. And we'll actually talk about that if we haven't already, because it's still existing under the Ming in the period that we're in now. That in order to hold any sort of political power in China, you had to be someone who could pass this very extensive examination system. In fact, it often took up to 10 years of study, reading, literally memorizing hundreds and hundreds of texts. Books that were written. The author here of this particular paper also uses Jared Diamond, who was one of the required readings for one of the weeks that this paper was discussing. All right, another example here, Pope Gregory's letter to Abbot Melitius, in which in this case, Gregory is talking again about the issue of theocracy and power. In this case, as she says, this, of course, is an extreme view of theocratic ideals. Pope Gregory believes that there can only be one outstanding religion, and that is Christianity. And in the course of the letter, even excuses violence to be used on non-Christians. So, again, this idea of the power that religion had and its ability to create theocratic states. Okay, in this next section, the author is discussing schisms, which was a big part of this because particularly Christianity and Islam both, and Confucianism and Buddhism, all of the major religions in this period split into different interpretations of their main texts. From our perspective, when we started the course last week, we were talking about the development of Protestantism, a very big part of what's going on in Western Europe and in the United States with the Europeans who were coming was this split between Catholicism and Protestantism. Two interpretations literally of the Bible and how you could read the Bible, or in the case of Catholics, if you could read the Bible, right? All right, so the schism issue addressed right here, very nicely done. Again, using various sources from Frankopan to the textbook. And then it's this last section right here that is particularly important because this is where the author of this paper actually analyzed the primary sources themselves as well as the secondary sources. This is the section where the author looks at the perspective and biases of the authors and their intentions in writing what they wrote. And this literally is the difference between this paper getting a B for the historical content and getting an A. This is literally what you're supposed to be doing. So through here, the author of the paper literally tears apart what the authors of her different sources were saying and what they meant, how they perceived what they were talking about, and why. And again, often using quotes. So I encourage you particularly to pay attention to this. The author also does a discussion of the secondary sources as well, the textbook, Jared Diamond, earlier up there, Frankopan, what their particular positions were, what they were looking at in the writing of the sections that the author used in this paper. This is literally the key target that you're looking for. It is answering the question historically, but also then analyzing how the sources you're using view this topic as well, the primary sources and the secondary sources. All right, so then down here towards the end, we have the references. Notice that they are in alphabetical order. They are all correctly by author, alphabetical order by author, correctly cited. Books are, the titles are in italics, shorter documents, letters, and so forth. The title is in quotation marks, as it's supposed to be. Author, title, date, location. These are all the component parts of what you need in all of your writings, whether it is your journal, or I'm sorry, in this case, the primary source analysis, or your discussion posts. All right, I'm going to send this out to you, this link to this video, as well as the rubric itself for the first primary source analysis and the sample paper. I encourage you to review them all, watch the videos that are linked in primary source analysis 1, the historiography ones, as well as the how to analyze bias in a source. And again, think very much about your own personal bias because that needs to be in your conclusion. Why did you choose the sources you chose? What does that say about you and your perspective on history? Watch this, consider this, think about it, and then if you have any questions, let me know. Again, the paper is due by midnight on Monday, February the 6th.